Alright, so this is my video essay. I'm recording on my phone because I don't have a webcam for my desktop. I do have a microphone, but I thought it's kind of best of both worlds. Maybe I get some better audio quality, better image, and I thought that maybe rather than just having a little, slideshow going on, I could have a little of my own touch and I can show my gallery wall I have here in my apartment room. And so I want to give that a little brief notice. So hopping right into it, reading through the interview with Playboy and Dr. King, there are three sections that stood out to me and that basically what this whole video is going to be about. First, I want to talk about that first, one of the first questions Playboy asked Dr. King about his daughter and how fun spot and that interaction they had with having to tell her that that is a segregated spot and that interaction he had to have with her. Jumping to that, I want to talk about his nonviolence approach. I want to touch on the church and how Martin Luther King felt a little betrayed, or betrayed is not the right word. He felt disappointed in the actions of the church, especially white churchgoers, and how they weren't showing up with him in the civil rights movement. And then lastly, I want to add my own flair to it, and I want to point out the allegories of the X-Men to the civil rights movement. And I think I'll tie it all into these 3 points. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to start with my 3 parts that I noticed from the interview that I want to go with. So the first being is this story that Dr. King tells, the interview from Playboy. The story goes that Dr. King's daughter, Yolanda, was watching an ad on TV. And she saw that it was advertising this new amusement park by the airport. And she wanted to go so bad. I mean, who wouldn't want to go? I probably want to go. But the reason I think he told that story and stuck out to him was that was one of the first instances of him seeing and telling somebody that racism is real. In that story, he tells that his daughter says, I want to go to this place. And then Dr. King having to tell her, like, yes, but that place isn't for you. And I think that we have a discussion of whether, like, maybe people are innately bad or whatever, people are born bad or made bad. And I think that can be kind of related to racism in a way. And I don't believe that people are born racist, but telling a child at such an impressionable age that they can't go somewhere because they're being discriminated against, I think really sets you up. And I mentioned something else that Dr. King mentioned, not me, but racism in a way is not created by laws or it's created by people. People decided that they don't want to be around black people and want to be separate from them. And yes, there's laws that support that, but it's the people, and it's this idea that the people are deciding it. This is going to lead into my next point, but Dr. King mentioned in the interview that he didn't want his daughter to grow up bitter. I think it's very easy when you are told that these people don't want anything to do with you, you can become very bitter and jaded towards them. And I'll lead this into my next point about nonviolence. And I think that whether I agree with it, but I think you can agree with something, or I think you can understand something and not agree with it. And I think that these black children in particular that have jaded bitter and these terrible treatment can want to return violence towards them, especially if violence is received. As I previously mentioned, this was leading me into my next point about nonviolence. During the interview, Dr. King speaks about his view on nonviolence. And I feel like most people hear this idea of, nonviolence, and maybe not everybody has really thought about it. And, it made me consider it in a different look. He mentions in the interview that nonviolence is it's the ultimate moral high ground. And I'm like, that's so true. Everybody talks about not stooping to somebody else's level. If somebody's insulting you, don't stoop to their level. You just become as bad as them. And I think Dr. King was somebody that was very aware of that. I think he was influenced by Gandhi, but I feel like also had a big influences on him is his faith in the church. And that will lead me into my next point about the church. And the idea that, turn the other cheek and not do as what they do to you, I think is a big influence on Dr. King. Something that he said, and I thought was really powerful, was nonviolence isn't doing nothing. It's choosing to act without becoming your enemy. And I sat there and I was like, wow. And it's a very simple statement, but sometimes the simple stuff can really hit deep. And it made me consider my outlook. During the class, I'm hearing all these terrible things done to Black people and their oppression, and I'm like, damn, like dudes don't hit back. And hearing that, I'm like, you're right, like that'd be stooping to their same level. And it made me have a different outlook on it. Another thing that he mentioned was when you allow someone or when you become nonviolent, right, and somebody afflicts bad things onto you, you almost become a mirror and reflect their cruelty onto you, and they can see that. And I think that's also really powerful, that almost the guilt of knowing what they're doing is wrong, I think can be incredibly powerful than just hitting back at someone. So connecting all three parts of the interview, I lastly want to touch on Dr. King's thoughts on his disappointment in the church. In the interview, he talks about how he was disappointed in the church, mainly white churches. I think it's very understandable. I think many white churchgoers would ideally be like, yes, the civil rights movement is good, and the integration and whatnot, but in practice, they may not actually want these things. Quite literally, they're not practicing what they're preaching. And I think that for Dr. King, that really hurt him, knowing that this is something that spiritually, like faithfully, that he connects with these people, but they don't align. I also want to mention that I think it also hurt him in this idea of them not supporting the civil rights movement, because in Christianity the idea is that everybody's equal. God loves us equally, and he all made us perfectly in his image. And to see people hear that, I would say that if you would ask one of those white churchgoers, they'd say yes, like everybody's equal. But then in practice, would they actually feel that way? Well, not so much. And I think for him it was a deep cut, and I think that he was really let down that this community that he was a part of wasn't supporting him and didn't show up and support the civil rights movement. To add to that, I think Dr. King also felt like he was worried that, in a sense, the church would become a social club with no substance, whether it be just be a collection of people gathering, but with no real intent to carry out their belief. And I think for that statement goes further than just the civil rights movement. I feel like a lot of people may be isolated from the church because they feel like the people that they're going to church with every Sunday aren't actively doing what they're saying. It's hypocrisy, and I think that really isolates some people and want to separate them from that. To wrap everything up, I want to give my own little special take. I know it's nothing special, but I want to say how the X-Men can be an allegory for the civil rights movement as well as the LGBTQ. But that's for another time. I want to focus on the civil rights. So the biggest one you can see between the similarities between the civil rights and X-Men is X-Men have this gene that makes them that has these mutations and have these superpowers that they're just born with. They're no different really than humans other than that. And because of that, humans hate them. They think they're dangerous and that they should be they should be eradicated or separated at least. And I think that's comparison to how white people view black people, as in they hated them or they felt like they were dangerous and they shouldn't be trusted and they should be locked up because, well, they were simply born differently than us. We're all the same. And I think that is probably the strongest argument. Another point, a similarity I see is between the two main characters, the two factions of the X-Men. We have Charles Xavier, Professor X, with the X-Men, representing MLK, and Magneto representing this more militant or violence approach with Malcolm X. Charles Xavier, and referring to MLK, believed in integration. He believed that humans could coexist with mutants, and he just through this with intelligence and reasoning with them, that they could eventually live in a world coexisting together safely and harmoniously. The X-Men were almost, I can see them as maybe the SEC, the student sit-in, and how they were a way of the college students representing this nonviolent approach and demonstrating it by Martin Luther King's ideas. On the other hand, we have Magneto and Malcolm X, as I mentioned, having this much more villain, not villainous, but militant and violence approach. Magneto believed that humans and mutants couldn't exist. There's just no way. They fundamentally will never. Humans are fundamentally flawed, and they will never accept mutants. And for some black people during the civil rights movement, I think that they truly believe that white people will never accept them. I think Malcolm X has mentioned before that instead of wanting to be accepted, black people need to bring up their own. They don't need to be. Why would you want to be accepted with someone that doesn't care about you? And in his version, with like his group of mutants, you can make the comparison to maybe the Black Panthers and so on. And I think it's important that we have stories like this that have allegories, because I think sometimes people find it a little difficult to be hit right in the face with, hey, you're wrong in your thinking, but you might see it in a different, you might see a different view, and you're like, well, maybe I see an error in my thinking, and then you can come to the table and reconsider. And I think that is very important, and I think that, it's worked for me. I didn't realize some things about my media. Looking back at it, I think Star Wars is a good example, especially now in our current politics. The resemblance are very similar, and that's something that I haven't considered till looking back at it. And I think overall, this reading through this interview and making my comparisons, I feel like I have a better understanding of the civil rights movement, almost like doing my own research and thinking my own thoughts and whatnot. And so, wrap everything together, I want to say that I think reading this interview, and especially with Playboy, how Martin Luther King was being like, let me get my message out however I could, I think really demonstrated him as a person of how tolerant he was, and even if this is something he disagreed with, he can still be like, I can get my message out and reach a bigger pool. Reading this interview and also making my comparisons, I've considered things in a different light, and I think that's really valuable, especially in college when you were here to think, and I think that's incredibly important. Most classes in high school, you're told what to think and whatnot, but I felt like by doing this, I was able to come up with my own ideas. I may have already come in with things I might have known already, but it still changed the way I thought. As I mentioned, the first thing about Dr. King, his daughter, I hadn't thought about what that's like to tell somebody for the first time that they're different or they're other, and I think that's really powerful. And so I want to wrap it up there. And so I just want to say I appreciate you letting me do the video essay. This might be one of my first I do, so yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think it gave me a different way of a medium of presenting what I've learned.